And good morning to Kendra Allen and Dr. Ravi Shankar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and then they're going to read an excerpt from their amazing books, which I just could not put down over the last couple of weeks. Kendra Allen was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. She is the recipient of the 2018 Iowa Prize for Literary Nonfiction for her essay collection, When You Learn the Alphabet, awarded by Kiese Layman. She has been featured on C-SPAN, interviewed in The Rumpus, and in Poets and Writers, and her work has been taught by New York Times bestselling author Jason Reynolds alongside that of Jamaica Kincaid and Eve Ewing, among other distinctions. She is the author of the collection Plate from Echo in 2021, and her new book is a memoir called Fruit Punch. Dr. Ravi Shankar is a Pushcart Prize-winning poet, translator, and professor who has published 15 books, including the Muse India award-winning translations Andal, the Autobiography of a Goddess, and The Many Uses of Mint, New and Selected Poems, 1997 to 2017. Along with Tina Chang and Natalie Handel, he co-edited W. W. Norton's Language for a New Century, Contemporary Poetry from the Middle East, Asia and Beyond, which is called A Beautiful Achievement for World Literature by Nobel laureate Nadine Gordimer. He has taught and performed around the world and appeared in print, radio, and TV in such venues as the New York Times, NPR, BBC, and the PBS NewsHour. He is the chairman of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and recently finished his PhD from the University of Sydney. His new book is called Correctional. And can we give them a welcome? I am absolutely thrilled to talk to the two of you about your transition from writing poetry to memoir. And so I'd love us to start with just a brief reading from each of you so that we can kind of get everybody on board with how phenomenal these two are.
You want me to go first? Okay. Hi, y'all. Thank y'all for being here. Okay, so I'm going to read a very short excerpt from Fruit Punch, and all you need to know is it's about how my parents broke up but didn't break up. And my dad's name in the book is Doll, D-O-L-L, so that's my dad. And then L-A is my mama, so whenever I mention that, those are those people. Okay. Sometimes I go visit, and Doll teach me how to play checkers in his room. I get real good when I play with red checkers and even learn how to beat him. He tells me I can come see him anytime I want. Then he get a woman to put a down payment on this Cadillac that's the color of your tongue after you suck on a green apple now and later too long. And he adores it more than me. And he gets too busy to play checkers. He loves his car so much that whenever I'm in it, he hands me a rag and makes me wipe down his windows if I lean on them. Then something happens in LA, let him move back in. She trades in the Taurus for this boo-boo green Ford Explorer that's easier to carry everybody. And that's the only thing that changes. Doll end up leaving again. It's words. I know words, y'all. It's his choice this time. He moved back to his hometown of Houston for good, and me and LA gotta leave Pritchard Lane after the landlord gives the Doll back the deposit and ups the rent. I don't see none of my friends no more until somebody died years later. LA turned 33, and we spent a lot of time in the Explorer listening to Hey Ladies by Destiny's Child on repeat, even though she won't divorce Doll until 7 more years. But come home bald-headed once me and her move to a 1-bedroom. Then LA start driving us back and forth to Houston to see Doll and pretend it's all for my sake until he don't answer her calls when we get there once while he's with his other girlfriend. Then we wait. Then LA listened to You and Me by Soul Child the I'm gonna cry, and I have no idea why I'm gonna cry. Okay, then LA listens to You and Me by Soul Child for 3 hours back when she thinks I fell asleep, but I'm listening with her as she cried with all the windows down. I watch the sunset behind us through the side view mirror and understand why it's her favorite time of day. Then it becomes my favorite time of day. Then LA never spent another half a day driving us back to Houston after she come home bald-headed again for the last time. I grow up and help LA raise me by growing up and entering into some type of sister wives union. We wed and we move through time and travel together while singing the entirety of Mary J. Blige's Mary as we pack almost yearly. Then she starts taking us to Uncle Needy's church every other day for 16 years straight. Thank you.
Ravi.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to start in the middle. This book is about, as we'll come to in the discussion, a number of different things, including my parents' immigration from South India, but it's also about these unexpected encounters I had with the criminal justice system. And I, as you will find out, had to do 90 days at Hartford Correctional the year I was being promoted to full professor. And in part, this book is about that. And I'm going to start right when I have to go in to serve the beginning of this. It's called just the beginning of chapter 5 in Unexpected Commencement. I emerged from the caged elevator to the basement of the courthouse, where my freedom has been officially surrendered. I'm searched for the first of many times that day by a brisk marshal who pats me down like a furniture appraiser looking for defects in an antique bureau. He confiscates my silk tie, my books, and my shoelaces, none of which I will ever get back, and leads me into a communal cell that smells of sour milk. I'm about to begin my time in jail. The only other person is a black man sitting on the floor. In his ripped sweatshirts and camo fatigues, he looks attired for a street war. I'm not eager to gauge what he thinks of me in my collared herringbone shirt and wool slacks. He doesn't bother to lift his head when I enter, but sings his greeting nonetheless. We headed to HCC, bro. That's Hartford Correctional. Don't get it twisted and keep it professional. I done me 2 bids up there, nothing but clown shit. That's county jail. We'll have to wait until court ends and more disconsolate prisoners file in before we'll be transported to HCC. I perch on my length of metal bench, screwing my face into an imitation of fierce. 5 more black men, 3 Hispanic men, and a white plumber's apprentice have filled the barred space with their curses and odors. We're given rubbery bologna sandwiches on white bread and processed orange drink, and as a lifelong vegetarian, my first act of communion with these other men is to share the wealth. When it feels like I can't wait a minute longer, the marshal appears. He seems to know many of my fellow cellmates, if not by name, then by crime. Yo, narco, you back here? He shouts. And you, restraining order? One by one, we're lined up single file, our palms flat against the wall, and our legs spread so we can be searched again. This marshal removes our individual leg irons and fastens us together chain gang style, our right ankle attached to the left, one of the men in front of us. We're marched into the Sally Port where a prison van waits. The black man in camos begins to hum a tune recognizable from ice cream trucks in the suburbs. His outburst earns him, "Shut up, you dumb fuck," and all of us a sharp tug, causing us to stumble into the back of the man in front of us. To step into the truck, we have to synchronize, lift our legs up and scoot together. It's a grudging exercise in humility, and once inside I understand why they call this the ice cream truck. The air conditioning blasts the metal seats icy as the truck lurches out of the Sally Port. Shoulder to shoulder, we smash into one another on lurching waves of pavement. The outside world beckons in tiny pinpricks in the reinforced steel of the back door. Probably be midnight before we see the dorms. Straight want to bet? Give me odds, 10 to 1. Last time it took 4 hours process, no joke. I would later wish that Hamo man had more hyperbole in him. We arrive at Hartford Correctional Center and are led up a ramp and into a brightly lit hallway dotted with cells, the faces of shadowy men pressing up against them. I try to shift the ordeal into an aesthetic experience, an act of immersion journalism, but I fail. Waiting on another length of bench to be unshackled, I'm panicked, exhausted, barely holding it together. Once we're uncuffed, we're thrust into a bullpen filled with men in no mood to talk. My head swims in a fog of exhausted unknowing. After a long while, I'm called forward, identified, fingerprinted, photographed, and like part of a cattle herd, stored in another bullpen. Then I'm told to strip, to trade my laceless shoes for a pair of black martial arts style slippers, which I later learned were called Jackie Chan's or Skippies. I stand naked in front of a correctional officer or CO in an open cubicle. He asks me to spread my ass cheeks and to lift my balls. "Check him out, Ramirez," the CO processing me sniggers, seeing my hairy body. "This way he come with a built-in sweater." My court clothes go into a box. I'm given a tan uniform, a little too tight and short. When I sit down outside a set of double doors marked emergency, a skinny guy with rasping breath and horn-rimmed glasses sits beside me. "Hey, I'm Jay. You new here, right?" He speaks as if we might be office mates at a corporate law office. "I'll let you know what's about to go down. We're not headed to dorms or the blocks. Summertime in Hartford, you know shit be crazy. Never seen it so crowded in here. My boy said they're putting guys on the gym floor now." We wait to speak to the male nurse who takes my vials disinterestedly and asks me very few questions. The mental health counselor asks even fewer. I hesitate when asked if I've ever contemplated thoughts of self-harm. By the time we're given a bedroll and directed to follow a CO, I don't know the hour. After all that waiting, we're through a gauntlet of metal detectors and walk past what looks like a mural of the world begun by children and then abandoned so that Eastern Europe trails off into cinder block. "Wait behind me in single file," the CO commands. He searches his utility belt for a key. When he opens the double doors, the yawning space before us is indeed a poorly lit gymnasium. Dozens of dark shapes loom on the floor, resolving into the shapes of men, a small village's worth. "We sleeping on boats, holy mother, no," Jay groans. "Worse than I thought. They got us on the gym floor." I'll stop there.
I was going to just jump in with how did you go from poetry to memoir? But hearing the excerpts and thinking about the reading of the two books and the subject matter of them, there's a running thread between the two of them, and that's trauma, right? There's a trauma of Kendra being assaulted as a kid and trying to process that around adults who aren't necessarily invested in your truth. And Ravi gets caught up into a system because of the color of his skin that just refuses to let him go. Talk to me about why you wrote these books and why specifically focus on those things.
You want to start?
I'm loud in general. I might not even need this mic. For me, I had to kind of be forced into writing this. Low key, I was not trying to write that. Again, I kind of grew up not thinking anything I went through was worth talking about because everyone around me, their issues was so clear as day, and I was the adult in the situation. And I was in Houston once, I was grown then, and my dad's wife at the time, me and her were outside talking about my daddy, and she just said in random conversation, she was like, Kendra, you've been through a lot, and I don't think your parents see that. And I was like, my initial reaction was, no, I haven't. But then my second reaction was, how you see it? And you've been knowing me since I was a kid, but you see me in the summer, maybe 2 weeks. But you see this so clearly, but why don't they see it? And so I was in grad school at the time when I started this childhood memoir. And I was in therapy at the time. And it was wild because when you go to therapy, everything starts aligning at some point, maybe a few months later. And she said that maybe 4 or 5 months after I started therapy. And my therapist just yeah, she's right. I've been telling you that. I've been giving you the language for all these things. I didn't have the language, so I didn't know I could even write something like this. And he would tell me, yeah, that's abuse. He'll say it so casually. He'd be like, yeah, I'll say something normal, and he'll be like, oh, yeah, that's physical abuse. Or
oh, that was not normal.
Yes, or, it's the one that really got me, emotional neglect. He was like, oh, yeah, you've been emotionally neglected your entire life. You don't even know how to have feelings. And I was like, okay, sir. And so I found myself writing in scene. Like, I would write a scene. I remember being in a treehouse as a kid. I remember, being in my mom's car as a kid. I remember therapy. And so I just started writing in different scenes, and they sort of all started meshing together. I wasn't writing it on purpose. And I feel like a lot of things I've written, it wasn't on purpose, except in hindsight, it was on purpose. It's the thing. And I talk about therapy in this book, and I have scenes of therapy in this book, because it would not have been a book if I did not go to that therapist. I had other therapists after that, but that's another conversation. But yeah, I'll stop right there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in. I mean, I think writing into trauma is really difficult because it's as close to nescience as it is to science. There's a lot that can't be translated into language, but for me, I didn't really have a choice, I don't think. The book describes, I read from the middle, but I initially had this wrongful arrest in New York when I was stopped under the stop and frisk policies of Mayor Bloomberg, and wrongfully arrested on erroneous warrant for a 5'6" white guy. And so I kind of write about that, but that first experience in some way kind of changed my relationship to the world, I think. I subconsciously became paranoid, and then subsequently had these other encounters. And in part, it's called Correctional because Connecticut, where I was living for a long time, is pretty sleepy. There's not a lot that happens, and so even though it was just a misdemeanor that I was accused of, I was a state university professor, and so it became front page news. I was on the front of the Hartford Courant. I was covered by, they had news cameras outside where my daughters were trying to go to school, and the stories were sensationalized and reductive, and so I felt I had to tell my story. But then it was really that 90 days that I spent, which was spread out over about a year and a half, which I talk about. So I had these very odd, that summer of 2013, I think I had to do 45 days, and then I got on a plane and went to Hong Kong to teach my graduate students, and then I flew back to do another 2 weeks before summer ended. So it was a really mind-boggling time in a lot of ways. But the silver lining was that I met men I never expected to meet. And what I knew about theoretically, I experienced firsthand. I saw the racial disparity and the disintegration built into the system. And these men in Dorm C made me promise them. They said, you have a voice out there. No one cares about us. We've told you our stories. We've shared all this with you, and you need to do something with it. And so I made them a promise. And so that was really how I knew that I had to. But it was not, and this will go into changing from poetry to memoir, but it wasn't easy because there are various layers of unraveling that have to happen when you're kind of getting at the truth. For me, it was like, how did in the midst of this very successful life, and especially as, a son of South Asian immigrants, a model minority, did I end up unraveling completely? I left my marriage, my home, my job. I ended up in jail, and so I had to really do a lot of introspection. But through that, I think I learned a lot about the country we live in.
Right. One of the things that when I write memoirs for other people, I find that when they get the finished product, they were very talkative, going into it, and, very willing to share their story, and everything is copacetic until they get the final product. And then it's like, I don't know if I want to tell that part. I don't know if this part should be in the book. And then we go and wholesale knock out entire chapters because seeing that truth on the page is really hard. So what was that experience for you once you got to the finished product, to go back through and read your experiences, experience that trauma? You are about to, cry just reading today. So what is that like, and how do you end up keeping those words on the page for us to read?
Yeah, it's trash. The entire process is devastating because you realize memory has been repressed. You realize memory has been skewed. You realize, like, the people who say they love you gaslit you your entire life and, like, knew what they were doing and, like, continue to do it. But you have to, like, write through that memory and, like, through those blackouts. And it was kind of the opposite for me. Like, I took 60,000 words out of this book. It was way longer. But I took it out because it was repetitive in a way that wasn't stylish, but it was redundant. It was like, oh, you haven't really worked through anything. Like, this is just the acceptance. Now you have to, like, process the thing in real life. And I think I took those words out because sometimes you just don't want to see yourself like that, to be honest. If I'm being very truthful, and, like, this is a childhood memoir, nothing really goes past the age of 18. And just reading that over and over, revising it, editing it, you realize that, first of all, you can't tell everything about one subject that you know at once. Like, you have to break it up. And I saw that in those other 60,000 words, that this is another book, or, like, this doesn't apply to this specific story, or like, we try to force, like, our entire lives, and that's not, like, how it works, especially in childhood, because we don't think childhood counts, or, like, we don't see children as people, or as people who, like, go through things that's worthy to be talked about. But everybody in here got childhood trauma because of that. So it was. That process for me was about reduction, and it was about understanding that writing this book is not gonna heal or fix anything, or if healing is even attainable completely. Like, we talk about, like, go to therapy, you know, get healed, get fixed. You're gonna be mad still. Like, you're not gonna be healed completely ever. Right. It's always gonna be, like, a trigger. And so I think, like, me removing those words and, like, going back in, of course, adding some here and there, it really helped me zone in on the actual problem I need to fix in real life, not just, like, writing this for your entertainment or writing this for, like, inner child healing or whatever. It's not that. Like, it's really about using this as, what's the word when you... It's like a vehicle to get to like, your actual life, because that's where it matters at. And yeah, I can have little tidbits in here to help me, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm gonna stop. Yeah, I rant, y'all.
Well, I will say, I mean, I thought initially that I would have this book done much quicker, because I filled, like, 6 or 7 composition books while I was in there. That's what I did. Everything from what I overheard to what they were serving in the cafeteria to the odors. I would write it all down, and I thought that I could kind of transcribe it, and I have this story. Of course, I was way off. And plus those early drafts, I think I was much more of a fly on the wall and not implicating myself in the action and not grappling with the difficult things I had to grapple with. And one of the things about memoir, too, is that you're writing about real people who in some cases don't want to be written about. My ex-wife, for example, did not want to be written about, but she's part of the story, so I kind of respected it by changing her name, but at the same time, I couldn't leave her out. And that part was when I had the final project and I sent it around, I was surprised. Well, my mother, who was opposed, of course, you know, in Indian families, if you ever experience anything traumatic, you dig a deep, deep hole and you shove it down, and you put the dirt on top, and you know, you never discuss it again. So she couldn't understand why, having come through this moment, I would want to rehash it all. But it really did take 5 major revisions and some time away from the project and the feedback of some trusted friends and my agent and all of that to help. And really, one of the breakthroughs I had is in the book, I write these 6 letters, which in India, there are 6 seasons. You know, we have 4 here. In India, there's also the monsoon season of heavy rain and the pre-vernal season that comes before spring. And in some ways, I mean, and I guess this is where the trauma I was exploring is, and maybe my memoir is a little unique because it's poised. I'm both someone who's benefited immensely from systems of privilege. My parents chose to immigrate here. My father was a mechanical engineer. And I was raised with this idea of kind of Brahmin superiority. In India, they have the caste system and this idea of purity. That's why my parents are vegetarian. And yet, at the same time, I was discriminated against because of the color of my skin, and because, like many of the men that I met, I had experienced some of those same things. And so I think exploring that connection and delving deep into that idea of childhood trauma, which I lived in India for part of my childhood when I was very young, and I write about that in the book. I moved back there, and when I came back, I had all of these great stories, but I couldn't communicate it with the classmates I had in America, who thought of me as different, and I wanted to assimilate. And so I kind of, I think, held myself as special, and perhaps later in life, kind of above the law in some ways. And so untangling all of that took a lot of time, took a lot of therapy, and it was hard work. I mean, in a way that poetry perhaps is not. I mean, there were times after writing that I was just like emotionally spent. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't really even talk to anyone. Mm-hmm. I had to just kind of burrow and regenerate or something.
It's like low-key worse.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really understands, like we're not out busting up concrete or, lifting things, but emotionally putting those memories on the page, living through them over and over again, and then trying to make sense of them is oh my gosh, it's heavy. It's heavy. Yes. It's heavy. Ravi, you mentioned that you wrote 6 different letters, each one representing a different season in India. And each one of those were written to specific people. It felt like some of them were apologies, right? Like, okay, I did this thing, this happened. Sorry, Mom and Dad, this was not, what you meant for me. Sorry, former wife Parker, this is not what this was supposed to end up being. How did, and this is for both of you, how did the folks that you ultimately wrote about, because it's not just your story, it is your story told from your perspective, but obviously you have to include how other people were interacting with you at the time, and maybe they don't necessarily see the story the same way that you do. How did you work through that in the writing, and then what was the response once everyone read your version of events?
Well, I can take this one first. I mean, those letters, which are addressed to different people in my life, and then the last one is kind of a letter to the universe in some ways. They were a chance to make amends, I guess, to the people who I might have injured through thoughtlessness. And, I had 2 young daughters, and my oldest, Samara, who's now 17, she's about to apply for college, but she was quite a small girl, but has memories of this time. And so I felt I had to kind of address that. And in so doing, that really helped me get through this idea of being disassociated from what I was describing, but really immersed, because these letters are meant for the people, but meant for the reader as well, because they're kind of tunnels into my psyche. My ex, I don't know if she's read the book. She's never said, I think I asked her once and she just ignored it. So I'm not sure. My mother also, while she's never said anything about the book, has showed up at a couple of events, which I take as a tacit, acceptance, I suppose. And I gave the book to Samara because I think she's old enough. My younger daughter Talia is 12, so she's still a little younger. But I want both of those girls, because the first letter in the book is addressed to the 2 of them who are bicultural. Who I don't want to kind of make the same mistakes that I did, but also hope that the America they live in is different than the one that I grew up in a lot of ways. And I want them to feel empowered. And so this book was about reclaiming that part of my story, I think, and telling it back to them. But Yeah, that the letters actually, interestingly, came at a very last draft. You know, I did these like 5 drafts, and it was right at the end. And it provides almost a kind of architectural spine, I think, because throughout the course of the narrative, you have these letters. And I've always been a fan of the epistolary form in fiction and other places, right? And I was also thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which is a beautiful letter that to his son, essentially, that entire work. So all of those things were resonating.
Yeah, for sure.
What did your mama say? Really? I want to know what LA said about all this.
Okay, so that's like the thing, right? Like my mama has been my number one fan my entire life. Like whether I'm dancing, I'm in sports. Everybody know my mama at the games at the school because she dancing, she screaming, she yelling. But that's also, I'm understanding in adulthood, a root of our issues and like our problems, because she has like trouble seeing me outside of things that I do and accomplish. So that's been the thing. So my mama, she love everything I do. She don't care. And like that, she's like, oh, you did it.
Did she read the book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great. She read the book, but did she read the book?
Oh.
That's a good,
Right, because I'm like,
yes, and I don't think she's read the book.
okay.
But yes, so I've been writing about my family since I've actually started writing seriously. So with my first book, I've had like those experiences where, here I go oversharing. I overshare a lot, y'all. I'm sorry. I just can't have small talk. Like I wrote the first book, and the day after that book came out was like the last time I spoke to my dad. So that was like almost 4 years ago. And so like I've had these experiences, but that's been, our relationship has been on and off like that. It's just been the longest we haven't spoken. But then with my mom, it's like it flips. So I have to be the one to like pull back and like break communication, because it's like I'm doing everything. I'm writing it in the book. I'm telling you to your face. I'm asking, can we go to therapy? Like I'm doing all these things. Like I'm having empathy for you. I'm doing all these things. But in your head, it's like, oh, I just want to post your book like on the internet and tell people my baby got like a memoir out, or she got this review, or like, you know, she's proud, but she's not understanding what I mean when I say like, I just want you to be like my mom. Like, I don't need you to do all that. And so that's been a source with this book where I have to be like, mama, like, I think we need to take a break from each other. And that's like horrible, because like my mom is my best friend, and sometimes it feels like she has been my only friend in my life. But I think I've been writing the way that I have because subconsciously I wanted these relationships to kind of change and kind of shift in order for me to continue having them. Like we couldn't go on anymore the way that we were because I'm changing. And so either you gonna change too, or like we gonna change the dynamic of this relationship. And I think this memoir for me was a last resort with my mom, not to be dark. But then in general, it's like this quote I read in undergrad a long time ago where it was, I forgot who wrote it, but she said, if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. And I kind of, like, yeah, that's a great quote. Like, I never forgot it. Yeah. And I kind of always approach the page that way. Like, I'm never doing it with malice or to, like, expose anybody. But if I'm involved in the scenario and you happen to be there, that's my story to tell, too. Like, we can all
tell it.
Yeah, like, we're all here right now, and if we all wrote something about this experience right now, it would be completely different from the next person's. And I have to, like, train my mind to do that because I'm liking who I am as a person now, and that's only a result of me setting boundaries with like these people who don't have boundaries at all, which like we all have to learn to do. So yeah, my mama, she liked the book. She be promoting it, but she ain't really read it. And yeah,
right. There's no way that she's read it.
Because we talk and she tells me things. I'm like, that's not what that book. She makes up the scenario in her head, and I'm like, bro, like, what's going on? Like, Yeah, but
Right.
yes.
Well, what I loved about your book, Kendra, was that even though you were talking about your childhood, it seemed like you were it did seem on the page as a reader that you were working through some things and that you were looking at it. I love the way that she would write, I was 6 or maybe 16 or maybe 9, or I could have been 5, who knows, but this happened. And, you know, weaving all through it is your understanding now of what was going on with you and to you as a child. Did you find like some therapeutic relief in the words on the page? Because it felt that way when I was reading it.
Yeah, but I'm just like weary of saying writing is therapeutic. I think therapy is therapeutic. But I get what you're saying. I did have moments where I keep talking about acceptance because that was like my entire thing, my childhood, whatever I was dealing with, push it down. I shut down emotionally. It's like, okay, I got to deal with like my mama emotions and her trauma and what she going through. I got to protect her from what my daddy doing. I got to convince my daddy I don't hate him. It's just like all this emotional weight that's like going on. And so like on the page doing I'm 6 or maybe I'm 16, it's just to convince myself and like train myself through repetition and rhythm that the ages do not matter. What matters is like that memory of this happening and you telling, like convincing myself that like, yeah, Kendra, you try to like create scenarios as well. Like I said, I'm like my mama, so I can see the things because I also do the things.
Right.
And so it's me like just accepting the language and the naming of things because for so long I was scared to name things because I thought like, oh, I don't want nobody to feel sorry for me or like I don't want nobody to look at me like a victim or blah, blah, blah. But on the flip side of that, I have a line in the book where I said like, I just suppress everything and I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me. It's not a big deal. But what I really should have wrote is, they won't feel sorry for me. Like that's the reality of it. Yes. So it's that. But it's also like we go to therapy and as adults and sometimes a lot of it is them trying to like make you be accountable. Like things are not happening to you. Like you have a say in things and everything's just not on you. You have accountability as well. But a lot of my stuff is from childhood and it was my therapist trying to convince me that you should not have been as accountable as you were. And it's like, yeah, I don't get that. It's not like going through. So like writing on the page allowed me to be able to accept that like 100% you should not have been accountable for anything. And like, it's okay if somebody feels sorry for you and you should have had somebody who felt sorry for you.
Well, I'll tell you, as a parent, it was as close to a parenting book as you could get from a memoir.
Oh.
Looking at it from the perspective of, oh shit, did I do that to my kids?
Yeah.
Oh snap, should I go back and talk to them about this? There are specific things that maybe I should go back and like maybe rehash with them, maybe apologize for some of the things that I've done.
Yes.
And so
or just acknowledge that you've done it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Ravi, there were parts of your book that felt more journalistic than a telling of your own story. You could go through and find statistics. There were parts where you were talking specifically about the stop and frisk program and how many people got caught up in it. I really liked kind of that turn in the middle of you telling your own story. Why did you choose to include that in your book?
Well, in part, after all of this happened, and I ended up, though I was a tenured professor, I could have stayed on, but it became a toxic environment at the university I was at, and I got this fellowship to go to the University of Sydney, which is where I completed this work, and I was simultaneously also working on a critical exegesis looking at the roots of mass incarceration, and especially kind of how it got racialized. I'm not a great conspiracy theorist, but I don't think it's any coincidence that the two great moments of prison growth in the U.S., one came after the Civil War and the post-Reconstruction in the South, and one came at the end of the 1970s after the Civil Rights Movement, right? And it really, for me, experiencing this firsthand, what I'd read the new Jim Crow and, watched the 13th, and I knew all of these things, but then when I saw experienced it in my real life, I saw how broken it was and how much money that we're spending in Rhode Island. I think that they spend $95 a day on each prisoner, 75% of which goes to security and administration. And there isn't a system to kind of help rehabilitate. In fact, what I saw was that the opposite was happening. And so in telling my story, I felt I really had to tell these other stories, the stories of these men, included telling the stories of the institutions that they had been exposed to from being young children. And, my own experience with Stop and Frisk was a personal experience, but then it really was caught in this great network of events whereby many hundreds of thousands of innocent New Yorkers were stopped, and it was later found to be unconstitutional. And so, I felt like I couldn't tell my story without telling those other stories. And I also have this kind of Buddhist strain which runs through the book as well. Because
that was really beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
The way that you wrote that.
Yeah, I mean, because it's in the kind of interface between all of these narratives that I feel like the story that I'm trying to tell, because I think though it's a deeply personal story, it's also a kind of quintessentially American one. And it made me realize the shadow country, because all this has happened in really the last 40 years, from 1980 to our current, it's kind of plateaued now and we're going down, but we had maybe 250,000 people in prison in 1980, and last year over 2.1 million people, so almost 800% increase in the last 40 years. And then when you overlay that with the demographic of who is being incarcerated, then it becomes a really stark portrait of what's kind of been happening underneath our eyes. And so I felt like, this book wants to join in that conversation. And my perspective, as someone who's really outside of that system coming in, is a little bit different, and I hope can maybe reach readers who might not know about it otherwise.
Let's talk about craft and how you found your way to the memoirs from poetry. As a writer, you know how it is. If you write fiction, nobody expects you to write nonfiction. If you write autobiographies for other people, nobody expects you to be able to write your own story. If you write poetry, they damn sure aren't looking at you to write, a novel. So talk to me about that transition. What words mean to you, and style, and why you chose to go from, one genre to the other.
Oh, yeah, that's a loaded question. I think for me, like at the base level of all the writing that I've ever done, it's because I'm so into music. Like, music has saved, songs in specific has saved my life. Like, I can remember sitting in certain rooms listening to the same song on repeat just so I don't hear what's going on around me, or like just so, like, giving me the language. I keep bringing it back to that. Like, I really lacked the language to express myself for a long time, but I could express it like physically. Like, I can do sports, I can dance, I can do that. And creativity has always been that outlet. So when I think about craft and I think about like how I sort of blend genres in everything I write, it's from me studying songwriting, like just me reading song lyrics and seeing how my favorite rappers sort of like do double entendres, or they sort of talk about 5 subjects in one verse, but like in 2 sentences. And I'm like, how do you do that? Yeah, like, what's going on here? Like, this is way cooler than my teacher trying to make me read Shakespeare. And so with Shakespeare, I get it now, but it takes some time. But I'm thinking, like, I always had these little markers and these references for me, and it's a rapper, Isaiah Rashad, who is like a big, big inspiration for me. Just the way that he has a way of being stylish with his craft, but like his content is so heavy. It's like so, it's just real. It's just real. So I would read his lyrics in the way that he constructs an album. I'm really big on track listing and like how songs go from the next and if it tells a story. And Outkast is another like artist who does that with like skits with their albums and like it ties into the next song. And so when I started writing, I just wanted to do that. Like I wanted things to tie together. And so I always thought of craft in those terms. But as far as transitioning from poetry to memoir, I kind of started writing prose. Like I was writing essays before anything. And then, like I said, the thing with my dad happened and I couldn't write essays. Like I was so angry and so mad that I didn't want to write long form anything. And I sort of fell in love with poetry. Like I started finding poets I love, reading poetry collections, Denene Smith, like my friends Nabila Lovelace, like just reading my friends who was like working at the time. And I couldn't write an essay. And so I depended on brevity to get those feelings across. And so that's how I got to poetry. But then getting back to memoir, I was like, I said 60,000 words were gone. It was just like a lot of words and chapters. And I didn't like how it looked. I was like, I'm bored. I'm tired of reading this. Like, this a lot. And so that's how I get to like my line breaks and like breaking up the page and breaking up the line because I'm able to talk about more with less, and I like a challenge. And craft-wise, like that feels like a challenge for me to talk about something heavy, but talk about it in a paragraph versus like 300 pages. And it's hard to do, but that's kind of where the fun of revision comes in. It's just getting that first draft out that's the hardest. So getting back to memoir for me was still about the music. Like it's still about the music, everything.
Yeah. I fell in love with reading the lyrics to Stevie Wonder's Musicarium.
There you go.
And what I think is missing for our kids these days is they don't have that physical album to sit and look at the lyrics and, like you said, see the flow and how each one of those and see how those.
Notes.
Oh my goodness, liner notes is why I write right there. Yeah. What about you, Ravi?
I'll say first that I wouldn't say that memoir necessarily is more difficult than poetry. I have a poem that I've been tinkering with for 20 years, and it's still not quite right yet. But the difference, this story first, I think the breadth that prose provides you, the kind of space. This really felt like a story that needed more room. I love poetry because it's so distilled and compact. It's like concentrated. As a kid, we used to have this orange juice concentrate, frozen stuff that you mix with water, and you get the big picture. Poetry is kind of like that. But this story both needed room, and then also when your life has been kind of covered by the mass media, not in the way that you ever dreamed to be, dreamed that it would be. I felt compelled to respond in a way. I don't know that all of the readers of the Hartford Courant will read my memoir, but and it's interesting. I would come to find out that part of the reason I was being promoted, I already had exceeded all the evaluative process and just needed to be signed off by the Board of Regents, who had been appointed by the Democratic governor. And so the reason why my story was covered, I would come to find out, was because it was an election year, and the Republican senator turned Hartford Courant columnist could use me as a convenient political football. And it was like, and also this kind of phony moralizing that took place, like the minds of the children. This my friend told me that it was described like I was a wild animal escaped from the zoo, corrupting the minds of the children of these college students. And so all of those kinds of things, which there is a little bit about mass media and about mental health and the room. But I when it comes back to craft, I think certainly revising, I always had a sense of the sentence as this lyrical unit, and that I wanted to kind of use the tools that I had as a poet, the rhetorical devices, the figurative language, the metaphor, the kind of compaction of language in telling my story. But it did take me, I think because writing a book that compels you is hard because you need a plot, you need forward momentum. And I found initially I could describe the space I was in all kinds of vivid detail, and yet it was getting the characterization and the dialogue and how the craft really came in, and how do I want to tell the story, because it moves around chronologically. It moves even backwards in time to my grandfather's life in India, as well as to where I am now and the time that I spent. And so arranging those pieces so that I like what you said about music, because it was about having kind of a rhythm almost. And then when I got those 6 letters, and it was like, okay, here's the kind of percussive spine of this piece, and it feels like now it kind of holds together. But it definitely was a lot harder, I'll say, because I've had poems that have come to me in a lightning bolt burst. And this book took 5 years of excruciating vulnerability and unpeeling and tears and thinking I wouldn't do it. And so that part was definitely harder. But I think a lot of the tools and techniques I had as a poet helped me a lot in writing this.
I admire poets who make the transition because y'all just write pretty. I was
thinking
pretty. Right, exactly. Right, you hear that? It's just, that's what it sounds, that's what it looks like on the page. It's what it sounds like when you're reading it in your head. It's very pretty. You had a chapter where every sentence was started with "I'm 14." Mm-hmm. Every sentence. And I'm looking at it oh, you better write, little girl. What you got to bring that to the page, yes. that almost that percussion that you're talking about to the page. How do you get that past an editor?
What's wild is it's really hard to tell me that I can't do something with my writing. It's very hard because I really go into it based on instinct, and of course, I tweak it, I revise it, I get it in order, and I've revised it 10, 20 times before I even give it to an editor, and I know how I want it to look. I know what I wanted to say. I know what I'm trying to say. So when I receive notes, it's if it's not urgent or I can see what you're talking about, it's I respect that, I get that, but we're gonna use that repetition again because it keeps the reader into the story, or
it worked.
I've edited myself before I even give it to you. And I think with Memoir it's kind of different because my editor, a lot of the times, she was just it's your life. It's your life. I can just...
You got a good editor.
Right.
And I think it's because I always set up the thing of I know what I want to do. And even if I don't know what I want to do through revision, I'm going to learn what I want to do. And so it's hard to... I don't know if that's a good or bad thing yet. But it's hard to deter me from my instinct because a lot of times that first mind, I always end up going back to it. Every time I try to defer from it or deter from it, it's harder to get something done. But when I go back to that original instinct of just trying shit on the page, I just want to try things visually, aesthetically, formally, and sometimes they don't understand it, but you gonna have to, cause I'm not finna change it. So that would be my answer.
I love it. And I think we're close to, we have 5 more minutes. What do you hope readers will take away from your books? What will they learn? And what do you hope that you are able to take away from these books now that they are out in the world?
Well, my hope is that Correctional is not kind of an inert artifact, but that it is a kind of a call to action in some ways. Because after experiencing what I experienced, I'm now a passionate advocate of criminal justice reform. I do believe writing and reading can be therapeutic. I'm a big believer in bibliotherapy and kind of doing that work so you can reclaim your own story. Especially, I'm teaching now in Concord, which is a medium security prison in Massachusetts as part of Tufts program there. And many of these men, their identities have been reduced to their inmate number and to the ways that they're institutionally, the crimes they're charged with. And so giving them a sense that it's actually helped them. The people in this program have gone on, some of them, to get Tufts degrees. And so I feel like this story is a personal one, but it is, as I said, a story of where we are in the 21st century as a collective. What do we do with the myth of American exceptionalism? And we have these ideas of equity, but how can we move beyond rhetoric to actual action? I mean, these are the things that I'm struggling with, and I'm thankful to say, while I was in the process of revising it, I connected with a lot of people at the Marshall Project, the Southern Law Poverty Center, the Innocent Project, and they're almost kind of, I feel like, this generation's freedom riders in some way, because they're actively trying to kind of dismantle and reconstrue a system that is costing us, whether we're Republican or Democrat. It's really a waste of our money because the system doesn't work. We have one of the highest rates of recidivism of any country in the developed world. And when you look at the countries with the low rates like Norway and Scandinavia, they have more humane systems that are intended to help these men and women reintegrate into society. And so, in the book, I trace some of this back to our Puritan ancestry and this need for punishment, but I think it's counterproductive ultimately. And so I hope that putting down my story, people feel compelled to act in some small or large way to help redress this. And personally, it has been cathartic. I mean, for a while, it was so demoralizing to be kind of raked through the media in this public way, and to have two young daughters. And in Connecticut, the small town I lived in, I was already half the population of color was me. There was another guy. We would sometimes see each other. But so everyone, I already stood out. When this happened, it was I live in Providence now, which is, people who founded Rhode Island got kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So it is, the first synagogue was founded there. So it's a little more, So it has been, I hope especially because through going through this, it's a litmus test. Who really believes in you? I lost a lot of friends, people who I thought were very close to me, and then other people I didn't know that well stepped up in a really big way. And so I hope that some of those people read this book, and if anyone is still upset at me, they forgive me as I've been able to forgive myself. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's the biggest thing that came out of it, is I was able to let go of some of that shame and some of that.
Yes. How about you, Ken?
Oh, that last part of what you just said, letting go of that shame and guilt. But I think I would want readers to simply take away that children are human beings with full lives and full thoughts and full everything that has nothing to do with the adults around them. And if we're able to see children as people, then, we can eliminate a lot of stuff that goes on in this world, because, children, as cliche as it sounds, really have the answers and are the future and are way smarter than us all the time. So that would be my main thing.
Thank you. Thank you both. Everyone.
Thank you.
Kendra Allen, Fruit Punch. Ravi Shankar, Correctional. Thank you. I'm Denene Millner.